Welcome back to Edison TV. My name's Andy Smith. I'm one of the analysts in the healthcare team in London. And joining me today to discuss our new note on clinical trial outcomes and endpoints is Savar Meddings of the Sunday Times. Now, we produced this new note on clinical studies sort of as a result of the previous one on drug pricing. And some things came out of there that we didn't intend to when we first wrote the note. But I'll hand over to Savar. Savar, what struck you from the note that you've read?
What I found particularly interesting is it was clearly more to clinical studies than just the results.
Yeah, and that came out when we were starting to try and explain things. You think we'll talk about outcomes and endpoints and the differences between them, but then I used to work in a clinical trials organisation and a pharmaceutical company, so I knew at the time there was so much more to a clinical study. An investor will probably worry about when a clinical study starts, how much it's going to cost, and of course the results, whether it's going to be good or bad and how it's going to affect the share price. But if you go back even to the early stages of the discovery part, the preclinical work where it's done on animals, the toxicology that's done in animals, then the phase 1, the phase 2, phase 3 studies, all those levels of clinical studies, they're discussed with the regulators every step along that way. And it's a two-way feedback. So the regulators are helping the drug sponsors, the drug companies, to get that drug approved by that constant dialogue. And this results in reams and reams, what used to be reams and reams of information. Now it's all electronic. Things like protocols with its amendments, all the preclinical stuff, all the animals that have been used, and then the statistical analysis plan. And so lots and lots of stuff actually goes on behind the scenes that investors never see and discuss with regulators.
Now, you managed to get your hands on some minutes from a meeting from one particular company with the FDA. Was there anything in there that investors would have really liked to have known?
Well, yes. And Edison, we've done, and when I was at Icon, we've done quite a lot of due diligence work for private companies. And in that, you get to see the confidential notes between the drug sponsor and the FDA. And there's obviously a lot of detail there. And by convention, all of that information between the drug sponsor and the FDA, the regulatory agency, or if it's the EMEA in Europe, the EMEA, is confidential. Supposedly for competitive reasons, because you don't want your competitor drug company seeing everything you're talking about at the FDA. But also companies would say that when you look at that, the responses from the FDA are quite robust. So as Savar said, there's some confidential information here that I'm not going to share, but I'll give you a flavour of it. So one question from the FDA, from the drug sponsor would say, does the agency agree that the safety and efficacy results of the clinical studies completed adequately justify the selection of the dose for this product? And the FDA's response, no, full stop. Now, that's not a detrimental response. The FDA is trying to guide the drug sponsor. But also drug companies would argue that if investors saw that, they would get pretty scared at that. But after that no, full stop, there's a whole number of pages afterwards of the FDA suggesting how you do go about this, how they would recommend that, and then how that would result in an approval. So I can see how the aspects are potentially scary to investors, but that convention, there is a lot of discussion on social media about should that convention exist, because should these documents be available to everyone to see so investors can make up an appropriate decision.
So you've actually looked at 5 hypothetical drugs and how they would perform in a clinical trial. What did you learn from that?
So in the table, in fact, it was an idea from my colleague Max Jacobs in the US that we produce some ideas on primary endpoints being met or missed, and the safety being as good as placebo or not as good as placebo. And then we put at the bottom of that table some ideas on the likely approvability of those. And there was a lot of discussion on social media to say that we should go back to the past and look at drug companies that had their drugs failed and then try and put names to those. But I think what we're doing for the future is we'll keep an eye, we'll keep this table. And the next time we have a company that has its primary endpoint missed, but secondary endpoints met and the safety not, then we'll be able to use this table and orientate it to the likelihood of approvability. So something for the future there on that.
So you'll be able to predict the outcome of drugs before companies know it themselves?
Not the outcomes of drugs so much, but the outcomes of the regulatory process, of how a regulator is going to respond to those.
So you do go on to look at paying for cell and gene therapies, and it's presenting a real challenge for healthcare systems across the globe, really. What are some of the payment options they're looking at?
And you'll remember this links our previous note on drug pricing, which is mainly for small molecules, to the, as you say, innovative therapies, the gene and cellular therapies that have been proposed by the drug companies as being a one dose or a one-shot cure that then recoups or saves the payers the cost of treating a patient for the rest of their life. Number of moving parts there. Does the drug actually result in a lifelong cure? And the data is a bit immature on that. But then how on earth is a payer going to pay for the rest of the patient's lives, or the drugs that are saved for the rest of the patient's lives? So as you say, Saba, some innovative ideas are being formed at the moment. And in fact, even in large molecule drugs like antibodies, there are things like money-back guarantees. So if patients don't respond, then the drug companies can refund the money in rebates, although a different type of rebate than most people think about at the moment. But because drug budgets are decided upon 1 or 2 years in advance for 1 year or 3 years, that doesn't extend to paying for a drug for 30 years, especially if it's like $4 million a shot. So there's incremental payments. You pay 20% on the first dose, and then 20% the year after, and over 5 years you recoup the coverage of the cost of the drug. And there are other innovative mechanisms that move away from the traditional per pill cost per pill to actually, as the note suggests, the treatment or the payment for an outcome, which, as we describe in the note, is different to an endpoint in a clinical study.
Because the point is, if a patient is cured, they don't need hospital stays, they don't need because of ongoing care, so the money is saved there. That's sort of the argument.
Yeah, and you can see how payers would absolutely recognise that. And I'm sure they do, because that patient then potentially becomes economically active again, whereas they would be nursed at home in hospitals, or at home with drugs and infusions and things. So you're actually restoring a patient to the workforce, and that's worth a lot of money. The question is, how do you pay that money? Over what period of time do you pay that money, rather than should that payment not be made at all? We've had some comments in social media on the previous two notes, and linking those two together, our next note is being thought about at the moment to be on biosimilars. And that links the drug pricing aspects with the tender activity and how biosimilars are priced, particularly in Europe. And the new FDA's interchangeability and the switching studies in clinical studies, which links to our last note on clinical studies. So look out for that. Thanks for watching, and thank you, Saba, for joining me again, and I look forward to discussing our next note with you.